Lynn Maxey, Texas Democratic Party, in opposition to this bill. I can reiterate all of the things been said about selective enforcement of this, but I want to take my time to talk about just a few other questions. Question number one is, who's providing these cameras to over 8,000 precincts in Texas? Is that the state of Texas? Is that reflected in the fiscal note? Or are we, this is an unfunded mandate to county government to buy cameras? Second thing, it doesn't say whether it's even an official camera. So the question is, could an election official use their own cell phone? What happens if they don't have the phone? Does the election judge have to find their own phone if it's not provided? Is there any repercussion if the election judge posts these photos online or does any of that? There's nothing in this bill that says how these photographs are going to be marked to know who the picture is. I take pictures with my cell phone all the time, and a week later can't remember when and where and who is in the picture. So how are we going to train election judges to use a camera in the first place, and then to put on each of these several hundred pictures they might take of whose name's on them? And at what point, if as I've heard the Secretary of State's office say, these things are part of election records, so that phone is going to go with the election records. Do they get stored for 22 months and then get cleaned for the next election? And if that's the case, then they're going to have to buy a phone for every election that happens. A May election, and that goes in for 22 months as a record. Then they have a runoff election, and that phones are going to have to go in for 22 months. So we're not buying one phone, we're buying phones for each and every election. I think this is very problematic. It's got a lot of details missing. And lastly, if I could say this, I will just make a comment about our transgender voters. There is rulings by the Secretary of State that a person who has an ID that is a photograph of them and they do not present looking like their photo ID still must be allowed to vote. In other words, you don't always have to look like the picture on your ID, and that opens up another can of worms. Thank you.
Members, Representative Busey.
I just want to delay so he can't get to his airplane. You said you wanted to not elaborate on some of the identity issues. I want to give you more time if you're willing to talk about your concerns there.
Well, this is just ripe for abuse. I think, as other witnesses said, I can see election judges being selective in deciding which IDs they're going to challenge, whether that's people of color or a person who speaks with an accent or speaks a different language. And it becomes a harassment tool. The question is, what happens if the voter says, I don't want you to take my picture? Is there going to now be a situation where that voter is fundamentally said, because you won't take, I won't let you take my picture, that they are prohibited from voting because of that? What happens if the election judge is doing selective, blatant, discriminatory things? Is there any penalty for that election judge to do that? There's just every one of these pieces of this bill leads to some unintended consequence, some kind of voter suppression or some kind of really screwing over a voter at the whim of an election judge. This thing needs to have about 15 pages of how-tos, training. There's a lot of things missing.
Just one more question. To your knowledge, is there any cell phone or camera that's 100% made in America with all of its software and parts and components made in America that we could use for this? Thank you.
I'd be ventured to guess not a single one out there.
Thank you.
Any more questions? But I'm glad that you did mention the transgender issue, because we saw that happening in Tarrant County when I was helping with Boiler Room, and I was helping deal with issues going on in Tarrant County, and it does happen. Just because someone may disagree doesn't mean that you should be turned away from voting. So thank you.
You bet.